Hi, this is Dave Etchell's Imaging Resource. I'm here with the new Ricoh GR camera from Ricoh Pentax. This is a follow-on to the Ricoh GR4 digital, but it's a big step up. The 4 had a 1/1.7 inch sensor. This has got a full APS-C sensor in here, yet it's very, very compact, as you can see. In fact, the logical comparison would be against the Nikon A. You can see that, in fact, they're really very similar in size. Ricoh claims a little bit smaller overall, and I guess probably counting the volume of the lens. When the lens is retracted, the Ricoh has a little bit smaller profile. But they're very close. Besides the sensor, one thing that's new on the GR is the lens. It's a 18.3 millimeter, which is equivalent to about a 28 millimeter on a full frame camera, f2.8. And we're very impressed with it just in our initial playing around. It's very sharp in the corners. There's no CA that I can find, no chromatic aberration, very little distortion, and seems to have pretty good contrast as well. It also has a 9-bladed iris, so that you get very nice looking bokeh out of it. We found a little bit of a bright line artifact, but it was really pretty well restrained, and the bokeh looks nice and creamy. Let's take a walk around the camera on to look at some of the controls. Looking from the top deck here, we've got a rotary control in the front that you can use to control exposure parameters. There's obviously the shutter button and the on-off switch. There's also a mode dial, which, as you can see, is locked. It's got a little button here to release it. So you won't accidentally change the mode dial as you're putting it in or out of your pocket. I initially found that a little bit annoying, but I really appreciate the fact that it's not going to change on me accidentally. Most of the camera's controls are on the back, as you can see here. We've got a typical 4-way controller down here, menu button, a function button that defaults to self-timer, a display button to change display mode, and one of the modes I have selected here is with the display off. That, by the way, is really handy for conserving battery power, yet keeping the camera powered up. There's a switch to select the function of this button to choose between autofocus or auto exposure lock, or to put us in continuous AF mode. And most of the switches on the camera are configurable. We'll talk about that a bit more with the menus. It's something I really like a lot, and you can assign a lot of other functions to that button there. And this control on the top here is a little unusual. It looks like a rotary dial, but actually it's a rotary toggle. You push it in to select, to activate the menus that's under it, and then by toggling left or right, you can select which parameter you want to control. And then you can either use the up-down buttons or the front control dial to select an option from that. Up here in the upper right corner of the camera is one of my favorite controls. It's a plus-minus button for adjusting the exposure compensation. You can see it going up and down on the left-hand side of the screen there. I really like this a lot because I find myself making little exposure tweaks frequently, although I will say that the exposure system on the GR seems to be very good. And I like not having to go into a menu or push another button and then rotate a control to do this. I can make it go away just by pushing the menu button or the OK button. Over on the left end of the camera, we have the effects button here, which also doubles as a depth of field preview. And again, as with most buttons on the camera, you can program this to have other functions. But if you press it once, briefly, you get the effects menu, which you can scroll up and down and select the effect you want. Or if you press it and hold it, it does an aperture preview, and that's what this little icon in the top here is. It looks sort of like an iris. It's just a momentary preview. You release it and it goes away again, but it's great for checking focus or depth of field when you're shooting particularly close-ups. Also on the left-hand side of the camera is the flash control to pop up the flash. It doesn't pop up a whole lot. We haven't played with it much. I'm thinking there might be some issues with red eye having it so close to the lens, but it's very compact and pops down very easily. You also have a multi-contact hot shoe on the top. Over on the right-hand side of the camera, we have the ports behind a little rubber flap. And we've got an HDMI port and also a combination USB AV port if you want to run standard def audio and video out of it. The USB port also serves as the charging interface. There's not a separate charger. You plug it into your USB port and it'll charge up from your computer or a separate power supply. And of course, in the bottom of the camera, we have the tripod socket and the ubiquitous battery compartment, which also holds the SD card. Nothing too surprising there. Let's go take a look at the menus next. This is a great LCD. It's a 1.23 million dots, so it's very high resolution, and it's a red, green, blue, white design, which means it's got white pixels in there. And that's great because you can get a lot more brightness out of it for shooting outside. I found that even in pretty bright surroundings, it was working very well. And you have a display button here. You can program what you want to show up. Can't really see it, but there's a grid showing up there, and then back to the full display. So it's full display, none at all, a grid, and then turn off the display completely, which is great for saving the battery a bit. So what I found really interesting on the menus was this Key Custom Options menu, where you can adjust how the different camera functions are mapped onto the buttons. You can register these, you can assign names to them if you want. You actually even have a settings box down here where you can store up to 6 groups of them kind of offline. The other ones you can assign to the My 1, 2, 3 functions on the mode dial. And looking at how you can set these, here's the setting for the adjustment lever setting. That's that rotary toggle I talked about before. Basically there's 5 slots there, and for each one you can pick any one of these different settings to go into that slot. I said earlier there were 23. I think in this case there's actually 13 for this function. And you can see here the default for setting 2 is actually picture size, but I was doing a lot of shooting under high contrast conditions, so I wanted the dynamic range compensation readily available. So I assigned that there. You can also have that rotary toggle immediately affect ISO rather than having to push it first. And then there's all these other ones. You can choose how the mode dial, how the settings are set for the manual or TAV mode. You got 2 different options for aperture and shutter speed. This is somewhat standard. You can also do playback dial, and again choose 2 different options for what you want the rotary toggle and the rotary dial on the front to do. But then look at this on the like the function 1, function 2 buttons. This is where we have 23 different options. So you can have no function assigned to it. 35mm crop, by the way, is the camera just does a digital crop of the image to give you a 35mm equivalent focal length versus the 28mm lens. But then all of these different functions here, any one of these could be assigned to that function 1 button. And this is where there are, I think, actually 23 different options. Same story for function button 2. The effects button, again, you can assign all sorts of different functions to it. And then the auto exposure lock, autofocus lock. You can choose it to be autofocus, or both autofocus and auto exposure, or just auto exposure by itself. And then the next, actually, for some reason they put it two positions down. You can have that either be a toggle where you push it once and it stays locked, or you can have it in this mode with the lock setting off. It just be a momentary. Again, the continuous autofocus setting up there, you can have it be aperture priority, or I'm sorry, autofocus priority or shutter priority. Autofocus priority means that in a continuous shooting situation, it's going to wait until it's focused rather than just firing the shutter every so many seconds. And this is an interesting function, the one-press manual mode. You can select either aperture priority, shutter priority, or program here. And what this does is if you're in manual exposure mode and you push a button, which is programmable, the camera will do an auto exposure cycle and either adjust the aperture, shutter, or both to what it thinks is the correct exposure for the scene. So that's nice. So you can very quickly get in the ballpark with the manual and then adjust from there. And of course at the bottom we've got restore defaults. So between all of these functions, there's a lot of configurability on the camera, and that is something I really like to see on cameras. It was one of the reasons the Sony RX1 was a big favorite of mine, that you can really set up the camera for just the sort of shooting you're going to do, for just your personal preferences, and it just makes the shooting so much faster and more pleasant. So that's the new Ricoh GR, a great little compact with an APS-C sensor in it, a great lens. We can't talk too much about image quality yet because we're waiting for the final firmware to come in, but what we've seen so far is very encouraging. Great detail, good color. It's just looking like a really great little package. So particularly given that this is $300 less than the nearest competitor, I think that Ricoh Pentax could have a real winner on their hands.